Okay, welcome to part B of session 3. In this session, or this part B of this session, I want to clear up one little thing that I talked about last time about the law of comparative advantage. And last time I focused much on just the technical aspects. I wanted to show you here's what the law of comparative advantage says. And it basically says that both people or both countries can become better off if each focuses on their comparative advantage. That was the key aspect. If they focus on their comparative advantage and then they trade, they can become better off than if they don't trade and just work on their own production, trying to be self-sufficient. Um, Now, to illustrate that point, I did a thought experiment and I said, what if you were the benevolent dictator? And I said, here's the original situation. You're the benevolent dictator. You get to redirect the two people or the two countries. Tell them, here's how you change your production numbers. And then I'm going to direct you how you trade. And then I, as the benevolent dictator, can make both of you better off. Okay, now that was a thought experiment. Now, one, I want you to be able to do that on an exam. It would be a hard question. That might be the hardest question I would ask on the exam, but to get an A plus, definitely, I want you to be able to do that. To have a situation where I say, here's the production technology, here's a specific outcome the two countries or two people are doing. See if you can show a different way where both can be better off. In the first case, they're not trading. Second case, they are. They may adjust their production possibilities or their production outcomes and show how that can be done. Now, that's a thought experiment. In the real world, of course, there is no benevolent dictator ruling the world, telling countries what to produce. Okay. But what I want to show now is that the same outcome can be achieved just by the two people individually making deals with each other, saying, here's a proposal. And the other may agree to that proposal, and they both can become better off. There may be lots of different proposals in a bargaining situation. Often one person makes a proposal, the other one rejects it, the second person counters with a different proposal. That could happen. But what we economists like to think, that in such a situation, they often arrive at the same outcome as the outcome you would get if there was such a benevolent dictator. Okay, and that's what I want to show you right now. Okay, so here's where we left off. Okay, I said, okay, following the book's example, there are two people, Jones and Brown, and here's their production technology. Jones can produce 10 gallons of lager or 5 gallons of stout in a 3-month period, or anything in between. So that is, to produce 10 gallons of lager, he must spend 100% of his time on lager, which would mean 10 gallons of lager and 0 on stout. On the other hand, what if he spent 60% of his time on lager? That would mean he could produce 6 gallons of lager. He'd have 40% of his time left over, and that 40% of his time he could produce 40% of the 5 gallons, which would be 2. Okay. Now, in the example I gave you, then Brown had another production technology. And I said in the original outcome, Jones spent 40% of his time on lager, so he's produced 4 gallons of lager, 60% of his time on stout, so he produced 3 gallons of stout. Okay. Brown spent half his time on lager, half his time on stout, so that he produced these amounts. So this is the original outcome. This is what they produce when they don't trade. Okay, let's suppose that when they're not trading, this is the Jones's favorite mix: 4 gallons of lager, 3 of stout, and this is Brown's favorite mix. Okay, now I wanted to show you that there's a way that they can alter their production technology, their production amounts, and then trade. and they can become strictly better off. And I said, and I gave you an example of what would achieve that. And then a new outcome, Jones ended up with 4.25 gallons of lager, 3.75 gallons of stout. Notice he has more of each. So Jones strictly prefers the new outcome. Brown, same way. In the new outcome, I said here, Brown gets 1.75 lager, 2.25 stout. So Brown has more lager and more stout. So he strictly prefers that. So it's almost like magic. There's a way with trade, after they adjust their production amounts, they can have strictly more of both. Now, the key is that they traded. Second is that they focus more on the task that was their comparative advantage. So, by the way, remember Jones had the comparative advantage on lager. Brown had the comparative advantage on stout. So I said, here's the original outcome. Let's change their production quantities so that now Jones will spend a little more time on lager. Brown, compared to before, Brown will spend a little bit more time on stout. Okay. I said, here's what would happen if there's a benevolent dictator. Now, in the real world, that wouldn't be exactly what would happen. Okay. Instead, and let me explain why I'm going here. Particularly, I want to direct you. It's on page 32 of your book. So the second paragraph in the section markets as discovery processes. Okay, so economists often will treat it as if there's this information that everyone knows. But in the real world, that's not the case. These actors do not have perfect information. In particular, Jones probably doesn't know what Brown can produce. Okay, but what might happen is Jones may just start getting these out of trial and error, saying, okay, maybe there's a way I can start making a deal with Brown and maybe make us both better off. Okay, and he might try lots of different proposals. So, hey, here, I'll trade you this amount for this amount. Would you go for it? Brown may say no. Brown may make a counteroffer. Jones may make a second offer. And they may keep going on and on. And then they're going through this discovery process. What's a deal that the other person would find something that he would actually benefit from and would want to accept that deal? Okay? So, how do we get to the new outcome? And so I want to explain you don't need a benevolent dictator. Instead, it could happen if Jones and Brown just happen to land themselves, discover this particular proposal. Okay. In this particular proposal, suppose that Jones, okay, I'll explain why we might have this proposal in a second, but don't worry about that. Just suppose that for some magical reason, Jones wakes up on some day, maybe it's the 10th day after trying to make an offer, and at one point, Jones thinks to himself, what if I increase my lager production to 6, okay, from 4 to 6, so that means I got to spend more time on lager, okay, and what if I decrease the stout production to 2, so if I go from 40% on lager to 60%, that means now I got to spend only 40% on stout, which means I can only produce 2, so that would mean now he's only producing 2 of stout, and he says, well, okay. Then I make an offer to Brown. I say, look, I've produced this extra lager. What if I've produced namely 2 extra gallons? What if I trade you 1.75 of those gallons, of those 2 extra, and I try to make up my stout by making a deal to Brown? Particularly says, look, Brown, what if I offer you 1.75 gallons of lager? In return, you give me 1 3 gallons of stout. Okay. Now I didn't write the numbers on here, but if Brown got that offer, okay, he would say, what would happen if all of a sudden I get 1 3/4 lager from Jones? Before I was drinking 1.5 lager. I can completely stop my production of lager, instead devote 100% of my production to stout, That means now I can produce 2 stout. If I do, excuse me, I can now produce 4 stout. If I do that, Jones is only asking me to give 1 3/4. So I'm producing 2 more gallons of stout. I give 1 3/4 to Jones. I'm left with 1/4 extra, and so I would get essentially like getting a profit. You would say that's a good deal for me, so I might take him up on that. Okay, so that would be a situation where that might happen. Now, I want you to think the one little last wrinkle to this type of situation, and it involves a textbook I used in a former course that I've taught. And in this textbook, the authors ask, what if someone could invent this magical machine that could turn wheat into autos? Wouldn't that be an amazing machine? And wouldn't the world love such a machine? And as the authors explain, guess what? The machine already exists. It's called trade. And the idea is these wheat farmers in Kansas, they can make so many thousands of bushels of wheat. They send the wheat over to Japan. Japan is maybe making these great autos, takes the wheat and trades it for an auto. All of a sudden, you send over wheat. What comes back? An auto. That's what Jones is basically thinking. So I've got this machine, it's called trade, where I can convert my lager into stout. So I take my lager, give it to Brown. Brown gives me back stout. And that's part of the magic of exchange. And that we economists, we love to see exchange. And think of it's just as productive and sometimes as magical as one of these special machines that can convert, say, wheat into autos. And so that's the way you can, it helps me at least to think about how this situation can arise and how both can be made better off. Okay, that is part B. It's going to be a short part of a session, but I wanted you to see this and start thinking about how, as a discovery process, these deal making between Jones and Brown, and as I said, when Jones is making that offer, Jones may have no knowledge of what Brown can produce. He doesn't know this ratio of lager to stout. He just starts making offers, hoping Brown may actually return and say, yeah, that's a good offer, or may make a counter offer. By the way, the only ones that will work, the only ones that can make both of them better off, is where Jones makes an offer, Brown makes an offer that involves at least one of them, and usually both of them, putting more focus on the task that is their comparative advantage. So in other words, Jones has to make an offer where Jones, starts making more lager, and where Brown starts making more stout. If, on the other hand, Jones made some offer that involved Jones making more stout and trying to make a deal with Brown where Brown would have to make more lager, there's no way that Jones could make such an offer that Brown would accept. There's no way, in a sense, to increase the economic pie that would make both of them better off. Okay, so once they start doing these offers, markets as a discovery process, it turns out through that trial and error, when they eventually get a deal, they will have to arrive at something where the two of them are focusing more on their comparative advantage, even though they may not even know what the other person's production technology is, though they might not even know what their own comparative advantage is. But these markets as a discovery process will help them arrive at that. Okay, and that was one of the points I wanted to illustrate from the book. Okay, so that was part B. See you in part C.